Welcome back to Earth Station Trek, a show where we trek from the early days on NBC to the future on Paramount Plus and everywhere in between. I'm Charles Kelso, and it's my privilege to introduce the Earth Station Trek crew. Keith Johnson.
This unit must survive so that man may live.
Alan Seiler.
Bow down before your robot uprising.
And Veronica Daschel.
Hi.
And we're joined today by Dr. Sherrill Hayes, the director of the School of Data and Science and Analytics at Kennesaw State University. Welcome to the show.
Hello. I didn't know I needed a cool catchphrase.
That's okay. There's a reason I just say hi.
That's right.
And don't forget, we have to say data because we're not talking about the character.
Right.
Right.
Well, it also it also depends on what part of the country you're from or what part of the world you're from too.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
I was gonna say, to quote Dr. Pulaski, what's the difference?
the difference.
One is my name, the other is not.
Right. Well, Dr. Hayes, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's a real pleasure to be here. This is going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah. So you're currently at Kennesaw State University.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And
So the School of Data Science, Data Science and Analytics was created about 3 years ago out of a couple of different units. We had an institute and we had would have been the Department of Statistics, and they were foolish enough to ask me to be in charge of them. So I'm captaining a weird ship at the moment.
Well, tonight the idea is to talk about the role of AI in Star Trek and in our own society. But before we get into that, what is your history with Star Trek?
Oh, wow. So my favorite little beginning story. So I was born in the 70s. So missed the original series, but was young enough and still excited enough when the movies came out. I had a trash can. Well, you remember the metal trash cans? That I had the Star Trek trash can from the first movie in my room, and one day my dad, who's a golf pro, he calls from the pro shop, and I'm 4 or 5 years old, and says, because my mom, he's like, you got to go and pick up Cheryl's trash can, read the number to me off the ship. And so my dad is big about winning things on the radio. So thanks to him being able to read the number of the Enterprise off of my trash can, we won our first VCR.
Wow.
And, which then I got to watch Star Trek on. We record record the cartoon, the animated series.
Yeah.
And then when I got into high school, the TNG was out. One of my friends, in fact, one of my friends, Dave Day, I hope he's my go-to guy when I have a Star Trek question. When it was on reruns, it would be on from like 11 o'clock at night till 1 o'clock in the morning on some various channel. I think that's when I watched TNG. We actually had a faculty member who lived in the dorm with us who was a huge Trek fan, and we had a room in the dorm that was called the Star Chamber, where people had drawn various ships and things on the wall, where we got together and watched Voyager, Deep Space Nine and Voyager when they were still, it was a big thing in the dorm. So it's been a part of my life for a long time. So
that's amazing. Those early VCRs were expensive.
Yes.
So that's a really, really great gift or a prize that win at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Did your love of science fiction and Star Wars and so forth get you into? Is your background in IT? Was it called IT when you were in college? When I was in college, it was just called engineering and computer science.
Yeah. No. This is the reason I'm an odd captain of an odd ship. So I'm actually a social scientist by training. Hence the Counselor Troy Toy in the background, rather than the Scotty or something like that. No. So I came to this field really from. Part of what we're talking about today, as a social scientist interested in ethics and research and the application of research. A few years ago, I started really getting in earnest into some concerns about the way that data was being used, and as AI has evolved very, very quickly. It's as somebody who sits back and watches it as a social scientist and a huge fan of science fiction. There's all these cautionary tales from Mary Shelley before, right?
Yeah.
The man versus machine thing has been going on for millennia. So that's my interest in this area in particular.
Okay. Yeah, and AI is something that we see a lot in Star Trek. earlier Star Trek, it was primarily cautionary tales, evil computers running societies, but all the way up through like TNG and the way they use computers and entertainment, a lot of it is sort of the way it seems like our interface with computers is heading. And I see some people saying that this is a great thing. This is a huge advancement for us. And I see other people, like I was watching an interview with Jeffrey Hinton today, who was formerly with Google, who said it was the biggest threat to our society, bigger than global warming. And so as a sci-fi fan who grew up with these stories, you hear that and it's like, which episode am I in?
Yes.
Well, one question I have to kind of shape that too is when you say AI, what are you thinking of? Are you thinking just of intelligent programs, or are you always thinking of robots and androids and computers that take over whole systems? Because there's all types, just like a robot can be an arm in a car factory. Right. All of our space probes are technically robots. So when you think of AI, what do you think of? What magnitude and what type of things are you thinking of?
You want me to answer? I think everybody else should answer.
Yeah, I want you to answer that.
So I mean, this gets complicated. You asked the academic the question about defining something. This is really dangerous. How long is your podcast?
As long as it needs to be.
Well, I think one of the problems we have is that artificial intelligence in many cases is really mislabeled. Some people are really talking about machine learning, which is sort of a statistical process. Some people are talking about robotics, right? So they're actually thinking about the application of artificial intelligence. So I think one of the reasons it's so scary to people is because it is ill-defined, because it can mean so many things. That's one of my concerns. So anybody that's like, I'm freaked out by AI, I'm like, just go look it up. Like go read something about it, understand a little bit more. Well, Chat GPT, which I'm sure we're going to talk about at some point tonight. I mean, it's basically just a large language model. It's a natural language processing model. This kind of thing has existed. Some of you will remember many years ago. You remember Dragon Naturally Speaking? Right. So it's basically, that was a baby version of this, right? So that was its very, very beginning. It's zeros and ones version of trying to understand something that people inherently have in their brains, right? So and then there's all these different iterations of that. Because it's not just natural language processing, then there's massive amounts of quantitative data. I mean, it all ends up getting broken down at some point into bits and bytes, but it is this kind of amorphous, mysterious term that gets used and misused by people when they need it.
Yeah, because it seems like when people think of AI in like what Charles was saying, in a worse sense, they think of a robot, an android, or some computer. Like there's an awesome movie from the 70s called Colossus, the Forbin Project, that is all about that. Some people think about that, but to your point, Chat GPT can be AI, or you can have a giant thresher on a farm that has AI to allow it to do the wheat, and it's not going to take over the world. It's kind of like, what is the AI designed to do?
Sure. I mean, ultimately, the thing people need to understand is it will do what it was designed to do, right? It is a program that runs a series of operations, and some of those things seem more human-like than others. I mean, I remember when we first started seeing the robot arms building the cars and the factories, and in the 70s and the 80s, people are, it's gonna take our jobs. Well, it did.
It did.
It absolutely did. So I think that kind of reinforces this. This man versus machine thing, which is, when we think about the history of science fiction, and the entertainment factor, it always has played this kind of cautionary tale role, but it's also kind of morality tale. I mean, it goes back in American literary tradition, back to like, Babe and the Big Blue Ox, and thinking about how Paul Bunyan had to battle the train. I mean, this goes way back in our collective unconscious here, about machines being somehow something that people create, but then they take over and they kind of create their own thing. My friend who he's like, oh, you got to watch this things I hadn't thought about years, like the episode The Ultimate Computer. I mean, gosh, yes. I mean, that was interesting. The cautionary tale at its finest. But what's so interesting going back and watching that in the context of what we know about where artificial intelligence is now, the very beginnings of that were really being researched back then. You have places like Bell Labs. They were really thinking about this, and really what they were trying to do was create a model, a mathematical representation of the way that people thought. And so the clever writers and directors, of Star Trek looked at that and went, "Wow, what a cool story!" And their imaginations, exploded this up into this, amazing thing. We're just catching up to that now, which I think people look at as, wow, I can't believe we're here. But there's a lot of things, and you all talked about this before. There's a lot of technology that we take for granted now that seemed, really futuristic and spacey in Star Trek particularly. But we also know that people that designed those technologies were watching those shows, and so they were inspired by it. So there's a part of me that wonders, gosh, when you hear Picard say computer, and people are like, "Ooh, can I make a machine do that?" Right? Because they want to be Picard. Well, you can do that now. You just have to be Alexa or Siri or whatever it is. Same idea.
I just want to jump in just for a second and say that for the people who are watching, if you have questions or comments for Dr. Hayes or for any of us on this topic, just drop them in the comments section wherever you're watching, YouTube or Facebook or wherever. I have one from Michael Phillips who says, I think it's important to consider the difference between artificial intelligence and artificial sentience and their different advocates such as Ray Kurzweil.
Cool.
Right.
Yeah, and an interesting thing, you mentioned the ultimate computer, which part of that episode was playing on the fears that were around in the time and had been going on for a while about mechanization taking people's jobs. And up to that point, even when that episode was made, they were primarily going after blue-collar jobs. It was blue-collar workers who were losing their job. But in the ultimate computer, Kirk wasn't a blue-collar worker. He wasn't a grunt. He was the guy in charge, and he was the one being replaced. And that's a lot of the fears that we're seeing now with AI, is that it's replacing white-collar jobs. So I'm curious what you think about how that's going to play out going forward. And I mean, should people who are in jobs that they feel like could be replaced by AI be retraining and planning for the future?
I am not a futurist, and I don't. and anybody that predicts something's going to get it wrong most of the time.
Right.
But that anxiety is there. I think what we have to recognize is that what happened in the industrial age with the introduction of machinery and the fears we're talking about in the 1960s, we are living through those times now in the information age, right? So we talk about the information age sort of starting in the nominally in the 80s or the 90s. Well, we're 30, 40 years into that now, and so as these technologies evolve, the same way that the horse and buggy was replaced by the steam engine, etc. That's just part of the progress of technology. One of the things some of my colleagues and I have talked about this a lot. It's a problem for faculty at the university. Anytime now I'm setting an assignment, because the essay was the thing you couldn't cheat on, right? Because you always had to write the essay. You might be able to sneak on the multiple choice or copy off somebody else's paper for a formula, but an essay was always yours. Right. It's not that way anymore. So now we're thinking about, well, how do we, when I'm setting an essay question, like I'm teaching a conflict management course this summer, culture and conflict class. So anything I want somebody to write, now I've got to go into ChatGPT and Bard and all these other and enter that in and see what answers it gives me. I got to store those answers. I got to refresh it. I got to do it at least 3 or 4 times. And then when students are turning stuff in, I have to reference it against that. Well, at some point that's not scalable. In actual fact, I remember, and some of you will remember this too, in college when search engines first became a thing, right? And my colleagues who were librarians were all up in arms. Well, nobody's going to have to go to the library anymore. Well, the libraries haven't shut down yet, right? Libraries repurposed themselves, right? Librarians became, curators, collectors of knowledge. They became people that taught you how to use those resources. And so I think to the long answer to your short question, do we need to completely reskill ourselves? No, but I think we have to be aware and stay aware of the changes and be flexible and adaptable. You might memorizing the entire Python library is probably not going to be very useful to you if you're a coder now, because you can just go into a system and say, what's the line of code for blah, and it'll spit it out.
Mhm.
That's
But
true.
if you don't know whether it's good code or bad code, how you're just going to put it in and it's not going to work. And well, why doesn't it work? So you're still going to have some knowledge. It's going to create some, let's say, shortcuts for people, which isn't a bad thing, right? People were concerned when electric dishwashers and vacuum cleaners came in that housewives weren't going to have anything to do all day long, right? I mean, there's always these concerns about what was going to happen when some new piece of technology comes along. And this is actually where conversations like this are super helpful for those of us that are fans of science fiction. We can go back and watch a show that's 50 years old and go, oh, wow, they were worried about this back then too. Or watch a show that was 30 years old. Oh, they were still worried about this. I mean, the electronic medical hologram, the doctor, is he going to replace the doctor as well? There's only certain things he can do, right? So that's in fact one of the things that I've been thinking about recently, is not just what the limitations of generative AI is, but my son's a musician and he wants to look up a song, right? So he's looking up a song. How do I play blah? And I was like, well, that's cool. It spit out the chord chart, or it spit out the tabs or whatever. He's like, yeah, but it still can't play it. Fair point, right? And so I think about the doctor, like he could tell you what was wrong, but he couldn't fix you, at least not right away.
But see, that's an interesting point, because it can print out the chord chart for you, but it can't play it. But there are programs that can.
They can.
But can it play it? It's almost like reading a dictionary as opposed to reading a novel. Can it play it with any kind of emotive feel to it?
Right.
No. Will it play it with any sort of variation? Will it play it exactly the same way every single time? And that's the difference between that sort of machine setting and the human mind, the human input.
Yeah, there's a randomness there because Data Next Generation, in his quest to be human, he was always, because Next Generation, it was all about classical music and Shakespeare. And Data was always playing music, and they always said that there was many times when he played music, he would always say that he was mimicking a half a dozen different musicians. And so to Alan's point, his music was awesome. He could mimic Mozart and Beethoven, but he was mimicking Mozart and Beethoven, and he didn't have what he felt was the creativity. Like the ultimate expression that is probably jazz. The best jazz is never the same whenever you play it twice. But with Data, it was exactly the same. So that was the question of, did he have creativity?
But that's why it was always Riker playing the jazz and not Data.
Yes, exactly. Right. Yeah, and I guess you can have a randomized button or something weird. I mean, I guess at some point in time they'll build something in to try to make AI seem more human-like, to make the little mistakes we make and all that kind of thing.
Well, even the electronic drum machines I had in the 90s had a button called swing, right? And you could right.
Really?
And
That's true.
it would just play just a little bit off the note every once in a while.
Right.
It was still doing it in some sort of a pattern. But.
And similar to that, there used to be a feature, like it would play a ride cymbal, but it sounded exactly the same every stroke. And then they started to randomize it a little bit where it would sound like it's on the bell of the cymbal or on the body of the cymbal, and like a brush on it instead of a stick. And it's interesting at how it mixes all that stuff in. It's still machine generated, but it has more of a natural feel to it.
The more information you give it, the more things it can do. I mean, it's just like
exactly
the more knowledge you put into a human being, even the more it can do.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, and that's please go ahead.
And these things tend to grow exponentially. So I think, I mean, I wouldn't try to guess what the limitations of these things are going to be over the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. But I know something that's been on my mind a lot lately, as someone who's an enthusiast about technology and about science and science fiction, but also an artist and kind of an old fashioned in that sense. Veronica and I do puppet shows. We do a lot of practical things on stage. And I have a lot of friends in my circles who are now facing where people can $4 and you can get an AI that'll give you, spit out a bunch of art of your face and different things instead of paying someone who does that, instead of paying someone to draw you, it'll just draw you. But I mean, I think there's some ethical concerns there because these things are trained on existing artwork. And I mean, that's a problem that I have with using it. And I've been dabbling with it, just trying to stay on top of what the tools are. But a big thing that bothers me is I don't know who I'm plagiarizing.
It's absolutely, and that's, I mean, that's true of any art. I mean, we're talking about this with music. You know, you can tell it, you know, write me a Nirvana song, and it pulls together all the discography, and it plays all that, and it creates this new song that sounds like a Nirvana song that no one from Nirvana had any part in, other than the fact that they had written a bunch of other stuff. It's the same thing with visual art, and it is problematic because there's no consent generally from the artists. Who are now in the what is referred to in my field now as the training data set, right? So the training data set is the sum of human knowledge. I mean, that's in creativity. That's a training data set's an interesting way of putting it.
But let me ask you, go ahead, Alan.
I was going to say that's interesting too, because of that very, very recent new Beatles song.
Yeah.
That's happened, and there are people who have responded to it like a new Beatles song or a previously undiscovered Beatles song, and they don't know because they don't bother to look to see, was that created by an actual Beatle?
Right. It seems to me that one of the things with this type of AI, because we haven't started talking about the killer robots yet, but it seems to me that one of the things when you talk about music and creativity and writing is what we're asking is, can you code creativity? Because we still don't know what creativity is ourselves. I've always found it very interesting that many of the most creative people in human history had what we would now define as mental problems. You know, they had schizophrenia, they were paranoid. Everybody like Van Gogh, and all these different artists, they have what we would call mental problems. But what we find out is when they were manic depressive and so forth, those manic sessions, those paranoid sessions gave rise to some of the greatest creativity we've ever seen. And then, of course, they would have the other side. And so, like what Charles is saying is, you might be able to have a chat GPT type thing to do a puppet show, but can it literally come up with something that nobody ever thought of before? That's creativity. And what's the difference between true creativity and complete randomness? What's the difference there? You know, where do we get our creative sparks?
That's what I'm gonna say. I mean, like, how much of what is being created now is actually new, and how much of it is people pulling from what they've read, what they've seen, what they've observed other people doing, and just pulled that all together into something not even necessarily new, but different. I mean, like, Avatar is probably the most obvious big example of the story that was pretty obvious. I mean, the technology they used for it was amazing, but I mean, there's so many fantasy series, especially that pull a lot from the Lord of the Rings. And I'm sure that there's something that Tolkien was pulling from to create the Lord of the Rings and all those stories. So
Beowulf.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I write and create a lot, but I'm pulling from things that I've experienced and seen in my life. I'm not pulling from the cosmos. It's a sort of a culmination of all these things that I put into my own brain over the last 42 years, and they come out in new combinations.
There's never our own conversations in our puppet shows.
Yeah, well, it reminds me of that scene in I, Robot, the film, when he was interrogating the robot, and he said, "Can a robot write a great symphony? Can a robot, conduct an orchestra?" And the robot said, "Can you?"
Good point.
And I think that's the point of humanity, because the thing is, like you said, I think of the human brain sometimes as almost like a food processor. You put all this stuff in and you mix it up, and something comes out that nobody's else ever done before. And if I could use two really obvious examples, probably the two greatest physicists who ever lived, Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein. Both of them used other people's information. Both of them were looking at stuff that other people had looked at, such as Galileo. Einstein had all this information down. There used to be this thing that people believed in called the ether, which they thought was this gas that light traveled through. Einstein sat in a Swiss patent office for years and literally just thought and thought and thought. Now, if you say you could replace Einstein with a computer, here's the thing most people don't know. Einstein was not the greatest mathematician in the world. You could find a lot of people who are better mathematicians, but he had a creative genius that almost no one has ever copied. Isaac Newton created calculus while he was hanging out at his family estate because there was an outbreak of the plague in London. And again, both
anything
of
else
those,
to do.
yeah, right, nothing else to
Anything
do.
else to do. Yeah.
Right. And whether it was an apple or not, he looked at something falling and said, hey, that thing that fell is exactly just like the moon being held in orbit by the earth. I can't see that we could code a computer to have those creative leaps. Now, they could maybe do all the math, but can you code an AI to make those creative leaps like people like Newton and Einstein make? I don't know if I can see that.
I mean, one of the folks, Dan Lecky's commented that sort of the idea there's nothing new under the sun. Well, there's that, and then the corollary to that, which I prefer, and as a researcher, is that you're standing on the shoulders of giants.
Exactly.
Right? You know, so you're not, and so I think one of the questions, this is where I got to get I got to get the folks that are really into Star Trek to help me with the episode Measure of Man from Next Generation. But what we're really talking about is the difference in sort of creation through synthesis, right? So you're synthesizing a bunch of stuff and maybe coming up with something that's sort of slightly better, incrementally better, versus something that is kind of revolutionary and groundbreaking, right? So it's interesting. We spend an awful lot of time talking about what sort of Chat GPT or these other AI things can do, and not much about the people who created it, who've actually done something pretty amazing and revolutionary.
Exactly.
Yes.
We're caught up on the product and not necessarily the creativity the people that created the product had.
Right. Because to your point, Einstein and Newton created something revolutionary, and then other people might synthesize something from that. And I wonder, could AI ever be revolutionary like Einstein or Newton can be? Because, those creative leaps are just amazing. Everybody been looking at the same thing they've been looking at for literally thousands of years, and they came up with it. And I don't know if an AI could do that, at least not yet.
Yeah, what you're saying. There's a lot of books that sort of come to mind. We were talking earlier about people with the mental illness. There's a book that came out in the '90s called Touched by Fire. Can't remember the author's name.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
That covers this. There's also a more recent book. There's a much longer title, but the short title is Range. You can look it up. It's basically about how most great revolutions and leap forwards and things don't come from people that are deep experts in something. They come from people that are kind of cross-trained, or somebody who's doing one thing and dabbling in something else, which is, what's a patent clerk doing dabbling in physics? Right. So I think it's that sort of idea that there's a little bit of knowledge that might be dangerous, but it might also be very revolutionary. And it's more about the way people think. I mean, there is kind of a psychological study of creativity, and basically what it boils down to is that it's how people think about problems. It's not what they know. And I think that's where your question and observation is a good one. Is we sort of know what a large language AI model knows, because it's everything that's on the internet. Now, will it find something and synthesize something that we might not have thought of as people? Yeah, that's entirely possible. There are another sort of branch of AI is visuals, right? So you're sort of scanning. I've got some faculty members here who this has kind of been their life's work. Is they program models to look at like cancer on MRIs and things, right? And what they found is that there are things that the machine learning out can see that even really, really well-trained doctors can't find, right? And there are actually things that it's detecting that experts don't necessarily detect, or maybe they don't detect it the first time, they see it the fourth, the fifth time. So there's clearly something that we don't know. There's this little bit of kind of weird uncanniness to some of the things we find, or that we're seeing that AI finds. So, for example, hopefully we'll talk a little bit about sort of ethics and AI a little bit. But there are things that AIs can detect about people that they shouldn't know, which is kind of weird. So, anyway, I'll stop there because there's great comments.
Yeah, I was going to say we've got a few good questions that we haven't been able to get to yet.
Go for it.
One from a little bit ago, about 15 minutes ago, unfortunately, is Matt Sweatman, and he is asking, is AI study and development happening more in the academic world or in the commercial settings? So is it academia or is it commerce that's pushing this?
Great question.
Yeah, so this is a question I can actually answer about this. And it's, what's interesting is it's actually at this intersection. And one of the things we do here, and plug for Kennesaw State School of Data Science, is we've been working for many years with companies who partner with us. We PhD students, master students, and also undergraduate students. Companies bringing real problems here to the university, whether it's all across college computing and software engineering, but most of the innovations actually being driven by companies looking to solve a problem, and it's being done very much in partnership with academic institutions. So many scientific things that happen are, I would say, sort of pure science. So my colleagues in chemistry or something might be, or in math, they've come up with this cool idea and they're figuring something out, and then they have this solution that goes in search of a problem. Well, in data science, there's no data science without some sort of what we might refer to as a business problem. So it's a really interesting partnership. At this point in time, in this point in history, where there's a lot of they're trying to solve some sort of real problem, but they don't necessarily have the expertise to do it in-house, or they don't have the bandwidth to work on it. So they'll partner with universities to work on it. So it's a really exciting time because of that, because we're getting an intersection that we really hadn't seen before in such a dramatic way.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Michael Phillips, all the possible priorities seem to want to make AI replace the things that humans enjoy doing most: writing, art, music, etc. Is that because they are trying to achieve sentience? It's the first step in the takeover plan.
That's why I do art.
I love that.
I also think it's like probably the easiest thing that you can put out there, using AI to create art, because of the internet and putting it out there. I mean, using AI to create almost anything else, it's hard to kind of get it out there, but everyone wants to see, oh, look at this cool art thing. Oh, look at this cool music thing, because that's like a common language for everyone.
Exactly.
So I think that's why it's seen a lot.
Right. It's not necessarily about the ability to get it out there. It's that it can be relatable. It can be relatable to anybody who sees it or hears it or reads it. It's something that kind of touches a broad spectrum of humanity.
And I think Michael's question gets to kind of the heart of the matter, because if you have an AI program that's programmed to do art, say paint, or you have an AI program that's programmed to do music, one that's programmed to do writing, I may be worried about them getting really good. I am not worried about them taking over the world, because they are literally only programmed to do one thing. So could a chat GPT ever attain sentience if that's all it does? Could the greatest painting program in the world ever obtain sentience if it's not programmed to look outside and wonder about the clouds, or to get pissed off because the neighbor's mowing at 9 o'clock in the morning? So it seems like to me there's two different types of AI, like we started out with. There's AI that are really tools, just a tool. And then there's AI that truly we're trying to mimic the human brain. And that's a different type of AI, because we can do all those things, but most of these programs can do one thing only. And I'm not really worried about Chat GPT taking over the world. I am worried about a human using Chat GPT to manipulate the world.
Yeah, right.
And that's a different thing.
Yes.
And that sort of goes back to the ultimate computer as well, because the flaw really in the ultimate computer wasn't with the computer, it was with the man behind it. He passed on his own faults into the what he created. And I guess do we have to be worried about humans passing on our own faults into these things as well?
The short answer to that is yes. And we already see that. And in fact, I hate to even bring up things, because at this point they're dated, but they're one of the examples of this. There's I'm always careful not to name names and companies, especially in things like this, but there was a company that created a sentencing program that was to help judges, etc., figure out what the sentence should be for somebody that had committed X crime or Y crime.
Wow.
And these things exist. So and we think about facial recognition softwares that help identify people that that are on the run and they're trying to find them. So what we find in many of these things is that the data on which they are built are faulty.
Absolutely.
And this goes back to the ultimate computer. So if you build a sentencing algorithm as to, you know, what if people did X crime, they should do Y time to get Z result, but you only build that on people that have committed crimes and don't include people that never committed crimes, what's going to happen, right?
Exactly.
So there's the bias is built into the data set. Why? Because we have a social system and a world that already has those biases built in. So now we've just baked that into this problem-solving mechanism. We've got the same thing with facial recognition algorithms, right? So if you opt into a certain kind of facial recognition algorithm, that's one thing. But mostly what they do, and this actually relates to some of the questions about, you know, art and music and writing and stuff. Some of that is we program machines to do that kind of stuff, frankly, because the data are easy to get. What is the internet full of but pictures and videos and music? I mean, you know, when it was nothing but FTP and we were all on a 14.4 dial-up modem, what were we doing? We were downloading pictures, we were downloading music, you know. So it's what the whole sort of infrastructure is built on. So if you're trying to, if you're just a pure scientist and you want to build some sort of you're just playing around with trying to build an algorithm, because there's actually a question, you're trying to build an algorithm to solve a particular problem, what are you going to build it on? Well, what can I find? Oh, there's a whole bunch of pictures on the internet. Let me just download all those pictures, and all of a sudden I'm going to build an algorithm to detect something in people's faces. Why? Because it's convenient that I can find all these photographs, right? So I don't think initially there was any kind of malice in this. I do think it was just sort of scientists just doing science stuff, but they happened to build it on photographs. They built it on audio. They built it on these things. Well, now we're figuring out how to take those things and make them useful. And, you know, back to the question earlier, business is going to try to make money on something, right? And what can we monetize? What can we operationalize to make some money? Because business is really the business of making money.
That question and your answer brought up a couple of things, which is one, ethics, and two, AI versus sentience, which we keep talking about. Because to your point, one of the, as I'm sure everybody knows, the biggest problem with the facial recognition programs that first came out, whether they were used by policemen or those on Apple phones, was that all the facial recognition programs were primarily created by white men. And what they found out real fast at airports and stuff is that those facial recognition programs weren't good at looking at black faces, especially dark-skinned black people. And if this was sentient AI, then the program would be like, hey, dude, I seem to be only picking up black people, but there's no sentience there. And like what you guys are saying, you can have a super sophisticated AI facial recognition program that will never realize that it's racist or prejudiced because it was programmed by guys who never thought about black people and women in their facial recognition. And so part of me would say, I want an AI program that could think for itself and say, hey, man, I don't like, but then I don't know if I want an AI program that can start thinking for itself.
Exactly. That's such an interesting point, Keith.
I mean, they don't, basically, again, they're only programmed to do one thing. They might do it really well, but I mean, like many of us, we don't know what we don't know. But we're part of our sentience is being aware of it. I mean, what's Confucius, right? You know, anyway. This is the cogito ergo sum. I mean, this is true in Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy. One of the key things about sort of our humanness is that we know what we know because we know ourselves, right? And we're aware of what we're not aware of, and maybe we're not okay with that, but we're at least aware of it.
And you are aware that you tied into a Star Trek episode, right? When you said that. That's Moriarty.
That's why I really want you guys to talk about those things. I didn't.
Well, before we get too far afield, I want to display the question that was just referenced, just to make sure that we get it covered. Is there a distinction between algorithm and AI? When, for example, Amazon recommends to you something based on previous views, is that algorithm or AI? And a definition of the two, basically.
Yeah. So the short answer is, if we think about what an AI is, just think of it as a whole bunch of algorithms, right? An algorithm at its most basic is really just a math equation. I mean, that's it, right? So it is a simple equation that's designed to solve a certain thing. And so what we have when we think about like a neural network, for example, a neural network is a whole bunch of equations all linked to one another. And when this part of the equation balances this way, then this other thing happens. We go to this other equation. It's way over my head, but I have some PhD students that we actually in our we have walls are just painted with the whiteboard paint. And sometimes I've seen them fill up whole walls with just equations of stuff. As I said, I was just trained as a humble social scientist. I was not trained to do math at that level. I do feel like Counselor Troy a lot. Trapped in engineering, I think, but it is most fundamental, really. If we think about an algorithm is kind of for our purposes in data science or AI, it's sort of the basic unit of analysis, right? So, and on which everything else is built.
Another question from Matt Sweatman, basically asking, are there efforts and is there a danger in how data is weighed? We all know that there is a lot of bad and prejudicial information online. Can AI judge the difference between fact and opinion?
This is, wow.
That's a good one.
You should come to my class when we talk about data ethics. The short answer is no. There's no ability to judge good from bad unless we tell it. Back to the point about what is what's a white face versus a black face, or an Asian face, or a woman's face versus a man's face. Unless you train it, unless you tell it, this is this, right? It was the question about Amazon. So one of the ways that that these things, that algorithms and programs learn these things, is this concept. It's human in the loop. And so and we've had some students and faculty work on this here. So let's say Amazon comes along and says, look, we want to design a program that helps people pick out better clothes, right? And so it'll provide you some options. Well, it doesn't know the difference between the red dress and the pink dress and the yellow dress unless you tell it that they're all the same here except for this one feature. And you tell it, and some people call that feature engineering, but you have to have a person tell it that. So you've probably done those CAPTCHA things you have to do sometimes, where you have to tell it what's a bike and whatever. You're actually you're actually contributing to human in the loop learning things, because it's providing these pictures, and it's basically saying, it pretty much doesn't know the difference, but it's been told by somebody else that this part of the screen is a bike, and this part of the screen is a tree, and this part of the screen is this, and you're just verifying that. So you're actually in some cases helping to build these sort of algorithms. So that's the human in the loop piece.
Interesting.
So and this kind of thing sort of happens all the time, but it's really important, because machines don't know the difference. A person has to tell them, but if you tell it enough, it'll know. It'll learn, right? And that's the supervised versus unsupervised learning, which is again part of above my head and above the scope of this podcast. But I think it's important. Yeah.
So, question I have then, because what we're talking about so far, we've talked about algorithms and AI that are basically soulless, and they just do one job or one function. When you get to the science fiction world of Star Trek and Star Wars, and what people are worried about in those kind of movies is not an AI we're talking true sentience. And now we're talking about true AI that thinks like a human, like M5. That's what Daystrom did. He put his engrams on it, and it thinks. Data is deemed to be alive because he is cogito ergo sum. He thinks. The Doctor and Voyager ran for so long that he stopped becoming a medical hologram. He became a sentient being. So, question here: is there a lot of research in the world going on creating truly sentient AI? And are you concerned about that? Are you concerned about the datas of the lores from Star Trek, or the Colossus and the Foreman and the M5s?
I just want my C-3PO. That's all I really want. I want my R2 and my 3PO to go with me everywhere. So let me say, part of that is I don't know what happens in the depths of MIT and other places, but my understanding from my colleagues who are the most the most deep into this is that is truly science fiction. Like that is so far down the road that trying to get something that can combine all these things together into a system. I mean, frankly, one of the closest things we've got to that now are like cars, right? So if you think about how does a Tesla operate? Well, a lot of it works off visual based algorithms, right? So it both internal and external. So I've never been in one, but I know people that have them. There's cameras everywhere. Well, why are there cameras everywhere inside and outside of a car? That seems really weird. Well, because part of how it operates is on this basis of being able to see stuff. Back to the how do you train AI to know things? You train it based on what's available. Unfortunately, this happened, and fortunately, we don't see it as much. But there were instances where children were being hit or people were being hit by these cars. They were running into the backs of things. And it partly was because, well, it just hadn't figured out yet that was something that you should stop for or something you should avoid. It just didn't know, right? And that's is, from my understanding, some of the most advanced stuff we have out there. But some stuff works on audio. Back to the natural language processing. If you shout, if you shout a name, which I'm sure if I shouted it right now, people's devices would start going off and asking you what you wanted, right? But it hears you, and there's concern about that. Like, is Siri listening all the time, or is Alexa listening all the time?
The answer is yes.
So the answer in brief is yes. But yeah, so I don't, to my knowledge, again, I don't know what happens in the deep dark labs, the island of Dr. Moreau. I don't know, but I do think that that is pretty far down the road for what we're talking about here. For something to be sentient, it would have to have all of the faculties that we would sort of have as a person, and those are also little bits and pieces together and all these different things. To my knowledge, they're not well integrated anywhere.
So
going back to elementary tier data, because you'd mentioned that.
Yes.
I mean, sort of what happens in that episode, they go to the holodeck and it's playing a Sherlock Holmes adventure. They already know the ending. So they go back and say, write an original Sherlock Holmes adventure in the style of Holmes. Right. And then what they get is a mishmash of different Sherlock Holmes adventures before they take the additional step and the computer goes crazy and everything goes nuts. But that second step seems to be about where we are now, where if you go to ChatGPT, and I've tried this, and say, write a new song in the style of John Lennon, the word imagine will be in the song. Yeah. It happens just about every time. Like it's made up of things that he's written before. Right. I mean, is that fair to say that's about where we are with the way these things that are at least available to us operate?
To my knowledge, yes. I mean, one of the earlier questions was about weighting. So one of the things you can do in a model is you can weight things. One of the things that made Google's search algorithm really revolutionary is it was based on the number of people that sort of linked to things, right? The number of people that basically rated it highly. And so one of the reasons that the John Lennon song is always going to have Imagine in it is because that's probably the song that John Lennon's that most people have heard. It's the one that's played the most. It's the one that shows up online the most. So the weight of that in the model for songs by John Lennon, it's always going to be higher. So sure. Yeah, so that's kind of where we're at with that. So yeah, the if you create a new Sherlock Holmes mystery, there's going to be a hound in it. Right. Yeah. Somebody's going to be wearing a deerstalker. I mean,
so you said something very interesting when it comes to Star Trek, because what you were saying is you personally don't think that we're close to sentient AI, right, in our world. But Charles made a good point, because in the Ultimate Computer, the reason M5 was sentient is because Dr. Daystrom literally copied his human brain onto the computer. Right. And so it was basic. And I think Dr. Soong did the same with Data. Right. So it also seems like in most of that science fiction, these robots and androids, their brains are modeled, exactly after ours. They're not some new kind of strange AI that we've never seen before. So I wonder, can we even create an AI that doesn't function like we function, considering we still don't know how we're sentient?
Right. Veronica's shaking her head, and I think that's the right answer. Yeah, we can only do what we know, right? This is where, I do hope my colleagues who are interested in technology also study philosophy, and they also study the arts, and they also study the humanities, because so much of what happens, I mean, the Daystrom example is a really good one. Daystrom didn't realize that he was basically traumatized, right? He'd been bullied and all this other stuff for all these years. And he was putting all that anger and rage onto this. Well, it was reflected in it. But back to what I was saying, sort of towards the beginning, that's the history of science fiction and fantasy. And when we talk about this, I mean, Dr. Frankenstein's monster. I mean, really the ultimate computer was just the Star Trek version of Frankenstein, right? So that's a trope that shows up over and over again for good reason, because it's something that connects with us deeply as human beings. It's something that it highlights our fears, and I don't want to get too Freudian, but I mean, or Jungian for that matter. But there are these things that keep showing up over and over again in human culture. That aren't going to go away. There's different retellings of them for different eras, but that's one of those things that's very real. And I think that's part of what this, this fear about AI really taps into, right? It's this sort of very human fear of being replaced and not being necessary. That's a very real human thing. Nobody likes that.
Yeah, that's very true.
Now, you had mentioned before we got started that you had gone on ChatGPT and posed a few questions for us.
Well, so this was, and boy, I mean, be careful what you wish for, right? I really, I recommend this for you all. It says, like, I'm going to be on a podcast about Star Trek and AI and how it relates to the modern world, and basically, what should I talk about? Well, so the interesting part was, so I have my friend I was talking about earlier. I called him and I was like, help, fill me in. So he's giving me some, he's like, well, there's this episode and this episode, and so we start talking about themes, and we're on the phone for like 2 hours. So I typed this into ChatGPT, and it spits out a summarized version of the conversation I'd had with my friend, who is deep and steeped in this and knows it, in the same way that you folks would. But it is really it's pretty interesting. So for example, one of the questions I ask is like examples of ethical dilemmas involving artificial intelligence in Star Trek. Okay, and so then it gives me a list of 5 things. It's like the rights of AI. In Star Trek: The Next Generation, the character Commander Data, an advanced android with human-like qualities, raises questions about the rights of personhood and AI beings, right? And it goes on. And then it talks about the control of AI, and then it talks about the Ultimate Computer episode, which we've talked about. Number 3, ethical boundaries of holographic AI in Star Trek Voyager, the emergency medical hologram, EMH, and it talks about him.
Photons be free.
Right. And then it talks about the use of AI in warfare. And then it talks about ethical programming and bias, which is some of the stuff we've talked about here too.
Right.
Bias in AI systems, and it talks about holodeck characters, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of the stuff we've talked about, it spit some of that stuff out as sort of talking points, which was pretty interesting to me. One thing that in all the times I ask it, there's no conspiracy theory. The Borg never came up until I asked it about and then I asked it about the Borg, and it only gives me very short answers about the Borg, which was a little worrying.
Let's not talk about that. Don't you worry about that.
A quick thought I had is, right now, it's like you said, since we don't think we can even come close to creating artificial sentience unless we can do something like Dr. Daystrom, right, and basically copy the human brain. Well, if we copy the human brain, that means we copy the capacity for good and evil. So if we did succeed in true sentience, we could have Lore, who's evil in Star Trek, and Data, who's good. So I have a question for you. When we start working on real sentience, what we think is real sentience, would we want to, and would it be ethical to program in what we think are sentient beings with something like the 3 laws of robotics? Creating sentient beings that we've already limited in their capacity to free will. Would that be right if we did something like that? Because I have the ability to go out and, oh, I don't want to say that. I have the ability to go out and do something bad,
Right.
and you don't prevent me from doing it. Would we want to create AI and then we almost lobotomize them and like program to, you can never do anything bad whether you want to or not?
I'd like to do that to some humans.
I'm just going to say,
Putting that out there.
whoever it is that ultimately develops sentient AI, I hope it's someone like Keith, because Keith's brain works in a process that I don't think I've ever seen in another human being. And you think of things in all aspects.
Thank you.
Hats off, my friend.
You're going to love that book Range. It
talks about that.
Yeah, it's spot on for you.
So how would you feel about that creating? Because there's an episode of, there's a 2-part episode of Voyager called, it's the one where they met Captain Ransom, the other Starfleet captain who was also in the Delta.
Equinox. Yes. Oh.
And there's an evil hologram of the Doctor on the other ship. And the good doctor, our doctor, says, you can't do that, blah, blah, blah. And he says, they deleted my ethical subroutine. And so they could literally go into the hologram, even though they were sentient, and they could turn good on and off.
Yep.
And so would you want, or should we create a race of sentient beings where we can literally go in and mess with their morality? Is that right?
Wow. This is why I want people to study philosophy, right?
Yeah.
It's but because you really have to understand it in a deep way. I have a student, a former PhD student, now graduated. And his whole dissertation was about ethical analytics, and of course he also has his undergrad degree he was double major in physics and philosophy, and I mean his stuff was deep, right? It's super deep. So we had these we would have these conversations, and again he was 1,000 miles an hour, way smarter than I'll ever be. But I'll reflect on some of the things that I learned from him is, no matter what we try to do, we always have our blind spots, right? So we're always coming at it from our own perspective, and philosophically, that standpoint epistemology, right? So even if we try our best to avoid something, it's probably going to happen, especially if we try to do things on our own, right? So this whole notion of sort of encoding your engram on sort of on a positronic brain, it's wow. I mean, that's super science fiction-y. Like we won't even understand enough about the human brain to be able to replicate it. And back to the very, very early days of what we now think of as computer science, it was basically psychologists and mathematicians sitting down going, how do we figure out how people think about things, right? That's why the neural network is a thing, right? So that's a very common thing in computing, but it's basically, it was a mathematical version of like how do brains work. So we're so, I think we're so far from that. But to some of the points we were talking about earlier, we've already seen some of those problems with bias in AI, whether it's training data or whether it's the intention for which something is created. So we're already seeing this at some level. And again, I'd like to think that these things have not been done for malicious purposes, and I genuinely don't think most people started out that way. But if they were working as a group of people, and so back to why is Star Trek so great for this? One of the things that makes the Federation so awesome is the Federation is interested in multiple perspectives, and they're always trying to solve a problem, not just from one person's rule, right? It's democratic, small d democratic in that way. And I think that's really important for how we're thinking about when we're developing AI. In fact, I mean, back to the episode, The Offspring, when Law's created, right?
One of my favorites.
Well, there's the whole battle about like, is Law really not only is she a person, like, is she property? What happens, and what happens to her in the end is basically, she has, as far as I can tell, she has a panic attack, and then it basically kills her, right? She doesn't know how to feel, and she feels things. And that's sort of the end for her. But the debate that they're having back and forth over, is she property? I mean, which of course goes back to some of the questions about data to begin with. Well, now he's something that's created something else. Well, God, where does that go?
Right.
But anyway, there's that episode really speaks to so many of the things we're talking about here. I would really say go back and watch that in light of what we've talked about in this conversation, and really dig deep on that.
There was an episode of Enterprise. We're talking about human engineering. There was a series of episodes in the series Enterprise that dealt with the augments, who were the descendants of the Khan, Nuni, and Singh. And
right.
I forget which Soong it was, but it was basically Brent Spiner playing, a Soong in the 21st or the 22nd century. And what happened was when those augments were discovered by this Soong, they were violent. And there's a scene where the guy who ends up becoming the leader of augments goes into Dr. Soong's office one day, and he said, "What are you doing?" And Dr. Soong says, "I am genetically engineering your augment DNA to cut out your aggressiveness." And the leader said, "You cannot do that to us. That is wrong." Yeah. And that was engineering a human. So that's the same thing I think about with engineering AI, because the Soong was like, "Oh, you'll still be brilliant and fast and strong. I'll just cut out your aggressive tendencies." Yeah. And the guy's like, "No, that's wrong." And that's the same thing I think about with computers. When they delete the doctor's subroutine, or people say, they wanted to create a race of slaves. That was the measure of a man with data. It's like, you can say that, but if you make them slaves, if they're truly sentient, they should have the same rights you and I have. And unfortunately, humans have a capacity for evil. So if we create AI sentience, I guess we should let them have the capacity for evil. And that's a huge discussion and a problem there.
Yeah, and we're over an hour at this point. So I'd love to come back around to this topic at some point and have you Dr. Hayes, because this is a fascinating topic, and there's a lot of questions we didn't get to, and a lot of things that I had on my mind that I didn't get to. But I really appreciate you taking the time with us today, because this has been a really fascinating discussion.
And this was a whole lot of fun. I would love to come back, and maybe we'll talk about something completely different next time.
Well, we need to do a deep dive on Deanna Troi.
Okay.
A character exploration of Deanna Troi.
Maybe we could do a part 2, and literally it would just be questions that are nothing about but Star Trek. We can literally say, "What do you think about this? What do you think about this?" Because now you set the background for us, and now we can talk about lore and Nomad and Data and Vol and Landru. And Control.
We didn't even talk about Control. I mean,
Lord, I know. We didn't even get to Control.
That's a whole nother episode. But one of the things that came up, and I'll, as long as is another thing you might want to talk about in the future is the VR AR thing. If you haven't talked about that in any depth, because that's something that is actually getting close to what we are really seeing on the holodecks. Right?
That's true.
We're getting close.
Right.
And some of that is driven by AI, but I think if we're thinking about AR worlds and VR worlds, and where we are technology in relation to what we saw on the screen and wanted to experience, that's something that is definitely worth exploring.
Absolutely.
That's not my area.
Yes.
Well, is there somewhere that people can find more of you or your posting or your work or anything like that?
Well, so I'm, they can find me at Kennesaw State University. We have a School of Data Science Twitter account. It's KSU Data Science. I have a Twitter. It's at Sherrill W. Hayes, and it's spelled correctly, so it's easy to find me. So, oftentimes I have to spell my name, but thank you for getting that part right. So yeah, you can find me on Twitter. If you want to see more about some of the professional stuff, I post a lot on LinkedIn as well. That's where we talk about some of these data ethics issues and things like that. So love to connect with people, and thank you so much for having me on. It was a lot of fun.
This was an absolute blast. I have enjoyed this so much.
Same here.
Thank you.
Alan, where can people find more of you?
Well, how about you set your AI to www.cosmicpress.com, and you can check out the books that I've written and books I've published by other authors and the other podcasts that I am involved with.
And how about you, Keith?
You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, primarily the ESO Network Facebook groups.
And Veronica, if people want to follow along with our quest to become more human, where can they find us?
Felt30.com that goes to our Facebook page.
And?
Monkeying Around, a podcast about the monkeys.
And do you have a closing for us this week?
I think, therefore I am.
Hey!
Oh, that's good. I like it.
That's a good one.
Love it.
All right. once again, Dr. Hayes, thank you so much for spending some time with us.
I-
Everybody else, we will see you live again next Thursday evening at 8 p.m. I know we have a topic selected, but I can't remember what we decided to do next week. So
it was either a bunch of questions or the Sweatmans. I can't remember where we are yet.
the Sweatmans, right? I don't know if we've actually asked them yet.
We should ask them first.
All right,
Amanda,
everybody.
be ready.
Everybody, take care, be good, live long, and prosper.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.